everybody, to our first hot topic. I'm Elaine Bernstein, president of National Council of Jewish Women, Greater Dallas. We have a very informative and exciting panel discussion for you guys tonight. We are talking about the up-and-coming process of redistricting and what it's all about, how it happens, what we can do to make sure it's fair and transparent. Gina Foxman will introduce the panel in about 30 seconds, but some housekeeping things first. Everybody stay on mute. If you have a question for the panel, put it in the chat and we will forward those questions to the panelists. Also, if you have trouble communicating, if somehow you get knocked off and don't know what to do, Melanie and Alex's phone numbers are in the chat. So just call them and they will help you. I'm going to turn the meeting now over to Gina Foxman, who is a member of our legislative committee and works tirelessly for the voters of Texas. So it's all yours, Gina.
Let me unmute. It wouldn't be a Zoom without forgetting to unmute. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you again to the National Council of Jewish Women Greater Dallas section and beyond, as well as the Women of Dallas United for Action for hosting this event this evening. Most importantly, thank you to all of you for joining tonight's very important discussion about redistricting, which is definitely one of the hottest topics in Texas today, among many others, unfortunately. Again, my name is Gina Foxman. I'm a board member for NCJW Greater Dallas and have been engaged in redistricting advocacy for our section for a little over a year now. During that time, I've had the pleasure of working with this evening's esteemed guest presenters, whom I'll introduce in just one moment. We all work together on behalf of our own organizations with the Fair Maps Coalition to organize around and advocate for a fair and open redistricting process in Texas, which you'll be hearing about more later on. I'd like to take a moment to give you a brief preview of our discussion. We'll be giving an overview of redistricting and its history in Texas specifically, and the current state of play and what we should be expecting in the upcoming special session. We'll also touch on actionable items you can take to positively affect redistricting in Texas. Eliminating the current behind closed doors system, which has left us with gerrymandered districts throughout the state. We're asking you to post your questions in the chat and we'll take them as we go along if we can. Don't worry if we don't get to them all. We plan to have time for a Q&A at the end. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers tonight. I'll start with Joaquin Gonzalez. Joaquin is a staff attorney for the Texas Civil Rights Project. His practice focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and more. The Texas Civil Rights Project is boldly serving the movement for equality and justice in and out of the courts. TCRP believes that legal advocacy and litigation are critical tools to protect and advance the civil rights of everyone in Texas, particularly our state's most vulnerable populations, and to effect positive and lasting change to law and policy. Thank you, Joaquin, for joining us tonight. Next up is Dave Jones, who's a practicing attorney and also president of Clean Elections Texas, a grassroots nonpartisan organization promoting transparent and accountable government in Texas. It was founded in 2009 by a group of concerned and determined citizens who were troubled by the negative influence of money in Texas. Dave is a passionate community advocate that works tirelessly for redistricting, transparency, and reform, as well as voting rights and more here in Texas. Thanks for being here, Dave. It also delights me to introduce Stephanie Swanson, the Redistricting Issue Chair for the League of Women Voters of Texas, a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots civic organization that encourages informed and active participation in government. Among many other voting rights positions, the League is committed to transparent, accountable redistricting processes that reflect the full diversity of Texas and that uphold the bedrock principle of one person, one vote. Stephanie devotes much of her time to the redistricting cause and is a steadfast leader in all that she does. Welcome and thank you, Stephanie. Tonight's event is very much a conversational and information sharing session. And to get us started, Steph, why don't you give us a quick refresher on redistricting in Texas, including some of the history of past redistricting cycles that will be germane in our current and future efforts to reform it.
So Dave and I are going to kind of split this section up a bit. So just quickly, in addition to the work that I do with the League of Women Voters, I'm also the state chair, or I should say state tri-chair, of the Texas Poor People's Campaign. I just got off my Moral Monday call. So I have my t-shirt on, though. I left it on for you guys. I know that during the civil rights era, that the Jewish faith played a very big role. And that was part of a key component of why that campaign was so successful. And that was because of something what Reverend Barber likes to call is a moral fusion movement. And during these major fights for all of these important civil rights that we have seen throughout history, from the time of the Civil War to Reconstruction, to the Voting Rights Act, so on and so forth, women's rights, when we got our right to vote, all of that was came about because a broad section of society came together to take these issues up. And so if I could, I'd like to share the screen really quick. I wanted to start by reading Reverend Barber's quote, because it kind of explains the significance with this movement that we are trying to build and the connection that gerrymandering plays with all the issues that we care about. So here's Reverend Barber. He's our national co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. So many of our legislators are in office because of gerrymandering. They are in office not because they won, but because their district was drawn to guarantee their election. And once in office, they use the power of racist gerrymandering to deny healthcare to nearly 5 million people, to deny living wages and paid sick leave to workers, to attack women's rights. Just one second, there we go. To deny protections for COVID to our children in school, to evict people from their homes during the middle of the pandemic, to attack the LGBT community, to attack our immigrant brothers and sisters. They would not have the power to do what they are doing without racist gerrymandering. And so what Reverend Barber truly believes and what he is trying to do with his campaign is to bring more people in to this movement from all faiths, backgrounds, races, and religions, because the more people that we have pushing for the same thing, the more successful we will be, our voices will be louder. All right, next slide, please. So I know you guys know about redistricting and why, kind of what it is and why it's important. I want to go over it just really quick, some bits and pieces, because there are some salient points that kind of connect to the discussion that we're going to have in just a minute. So you all know that redistricting starts with a census, and the census was a very important part of what the founding fathers viewed for our country. It was so important that they put the census in the Constitution. There's a good reason for that, right? We need to be able to track changes in our population in order to govern our state properly. So they wanted to know where people were moving so they could send resources out. But in 1964, I believe it was, there was an important Supreme Court decision called Reynolds versus Sims. That's often referred to as the one person, one vote ruling. And it was that ruling that said that all of our election districts here in America have to be equal in size, equal in population size, that is. So the reason that they did that was so everyone has the equal amount of representation, basically. And so now every 10 years after the census, every jurisdiction in the US usually is redistricting in the following year. So that's everything from US Congress all the way down to your local school boards and city council races. Oops.
Oops, Melanie, you're screen sharing your email.
Yes, I apologize for that. I don't know what suddenly happened. It turned up.
I can go on. It's fine. No worries. This is my usual spiel that I give, so I got it memorized. Don't worry. So all of our districts are going to have to be redistricted. So you guys got that part too. And at the Texas legislature, because that's the one those are the districts that most folks care about. The Texas legislature is going to be drawing our U.S. congressional districts, our state house, our state senate, and our state board of education as well. And the problem with this, with legislators drawing their own districts, is we have the fox in charge of the hen house, right? It's a really bad idea for having elected officials draw their own districts. And if we have the presentation back up, if you could go to the next slide, that kind of carries over the discussion. And so where all of this process goes wrong is because of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a process of drawing district lines to favor one party or group of people over another. We have two types of gerrymandering that are allowed and permissible right now. I'm sorry, there's two types, one's allowed and one's not allowed. So we have partisan gerrymandering, which is allowed by the Supreme Court. They said partisan gerrymandering is fine. Partisan gerrymandering is when districts are drawn based on partisanship, right? So they know who's a Democrat, who's a Republican, and they go, they use election data and draw districts based off of that. Racial gerrymandering is the other type of gerrymandering. That was outlawed in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Unfortunately, though, elected officials still tend to use racial gerrymandering today. In fact, in 2011, the maps that the legislator drew were found to intentionally discriminate against voters of color. Okay, so the problem with partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering being in existence at the same time, especially in states in the South, is that race and partisanship often go hand in hand. So you can't have partisan gerrymandering without having the effect of racial gerrymandering. And that's where everything tends to go south. So if you look at the overall diversity of our state, you see that 56% of our population consists of people of color. But when you look at the makeup of the legislator, you see that only 36% of our elected officials are people of color. And that skew that you see, that difference is because of partisan and racial gerrymandering. All right, next slide, please. And I'm going to give you a longer history, looking back even farther than just the past 10 years. And then Dave's going to get you caught up over the past 10 years because a lot's happened in the last 10 years, unfortunately. So ever since the time of Reconstruction, elected officials have really been very clever, and unfortunately, at the ways that they have manipulated elections to maintain power. So even after they outlawed slavery and Black men were allowed to vote, they really started picking up on different means of skewing elections. So they used racial gerrymandering, they used multi-member districts. All of this really diminished the ability of candidates of color to be elected to office. So much so that here in Texas, you didn't see any elected officials that were people of color until the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed. Okay, but we're going to take a look back at 1944. So it was actually even further than that. In the 1920s, the Democratic Party here in Texas implemented the all-white primary. And with that, they said that people of color couldn't vote in the primary. It took 25 years almost for this law to be overturned. And the group that did that was Dr. Lonnie Smith out of Houston. He worked with the local NAACP chapter there, along with Thurgood Marshall, who would go on to become the first Black Supreme Court justice. So they were able to overturn the all-white primary here in Texas. That being said, you would hope that you would see more diversity at the legislature, and that wasn't the case. In fact, you really didn't see an improvement in the diversity in the legislature until 1964 came around with the passage of Reynolds versus Sims, which was that one person, one vote ruling that we talked about earlier. That helps keep our district sizes balanced, and that would allow larger populations of voters of color to finally elect candidates of their choice. We saw some more improvements with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And then we saw a huge amount of improvement in 1973. There was another famous Supreme Court case that came out of Texas. It was Graves versus Barnes. This Supreme case was important. It overturned multi-member districts for our state legislative districts. That meant all of our districts now had to be, their elections had to be run out of single member districts. And after that Supreme Court decision, you actually saw, I think, 5 members to the state legislature be elected from the Houston area. And so this one area in Houston where Barbara Jordan was, it's actually in the 5th Ward area on the east side. You had a lot of really important Congress people, really famous people from that area of town. And their election was in part from all these improvements that we saw in the grand scheme of things with all these Supreme Court decisions. So you had Barbara Jordan, you had Mickey Leland. Right now, that congressional district that I'm thinking of is the congressional district for not Barbara Jordan, Barbara Lee, I believe. Okay. But I want to point out that really all the way up until 1973, what was being used up until that point was racial gerrymandering. And then from 1973 on, what you saw was the legislature really take a hold of partisan gerrymandering and use that quite heavily to their advantage. So I'm going to pass it over to Dave now, because I think I'm stopping where he's going to start, I hope.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. I kind of want to pick up on the history a little bit and bring it up to the last decade, basically, and the last round of redistricting that was done in 2011, and talk about sort of how the landscape for redistricting litigation is going to change in this next round based on some United States Supreme Court opinions, essentially, that have happened in the last decade that a lot of you have probably heard of, but that will have a pretty significant impact on just sort of how redistricting is done and what we can do about it in the courts. And I have some slides too, if you could bring them up on this, whoever's doing that.
I'll take care of it, Dave. Why don't you just keep talking and I'll get them up.
Okay. I mean, basically where we started with this in 2010, 2011, the last decennial, we had the 14th Amendment available to us. We had the 15th Amendment available to us to assure fair redistricting. And we had a strong Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was available also. At that time.
Melanie, sorry, Dave, it's your email again.
I realize that, Gina. I'm trying to get it up.
That's okay. I can just keep talking too, man. We're all professional talkers. That's what we do. That's our gig here. So in 2010, there it is. In 2010, we still had in the Voting Rights Act the pre-clearance requirement that was still valid, and that was an important protection at that time for states like Texas that were subject to pre-clearance, because any kind of change in the voting laws had to pass muster through the Justice Department of the United States or through a court, and it placed the burden of proof really on the state to try to do something about that. Next slide, please. What happened in the last decade is really three cases that have changed the game a lot, and the Shelby County versus Holder case is probably the most significant, because the court in that case did away with the pre-clearance requirement. I put Abbott versus Perez in this list. Now, that is the Texas case that was about the 2011 maps, and then also including, there was a mid-decade redistricting in 2013 that the courts ordered some interim maps, and then the state of Texas basically came along and ratified those maps. And that created some presumptions and let Texas off the hook, basically, in a way that I think is real important. And then the final case that I think has really changed it for the upcoming redistricting cycle is the Rucho versus Common Cause, which is the partisan gerrymandering case. Back in 2010, nobody really knew whether partisan gerrymandering was going to be held to be constitutional by the United States Supreme Court or not. And at least in my view, and the view of a lot of other people, that the threat of that at least probably had an impact. And that case did away with that question mark. So next slide, please. That, like I said, Shelby County did away with what everybody says pre-clearance, which is the procedure for actually having to have states like Texas be subject to checking their voting laws. But what the Supreme Court said was that the coverage formula for the Voting Rights Act, that in the past, it states like Texas that it had a history of discrimination. The court said that past history is relevant, but it's not the only thing. And that at this point, the courts have to consider current conditions, and it basically held that as applied, the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act was no longer in effect. So we don't have pre-clearance anymore, and that is the biggest change there is. Next slide, please. Lawsuits can still be brought under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act for racial gerrymandering since Shelby County. But without Section 5, the impact of it is really important from a legal standpoint, because it effectively changes the burden of proof and who has to show that there's been discrimination and how they show it. That changes everything. It already has. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act permits people to sue for racial discrimination in redistricting, but those lawsuits can be lengthy and expensive. And as we found out in the last cycle, after Shelby County, the Abbott versus Perez case went on for almost the rest of the decade, and it was just recently. In fact, I think I heard somebody say the other day that they're still fighting over the attorney's fees in Abbott versus Perez. So next slide, please. Abbott versus Perez is the Texas case on the last round of redistricting. The court, it's an opinion by Justice Alito, 5-4 decision, that even though there had been findings in the district court about intentional discrimination in the 2011 maps and in the 2013 maps, because the court ordered some interim maps and the state legislature basically ratified those, the Supreme Court in the end in 2018 in Abbott versus Perez found that the burden was on the challengers, the plaintiffs in the case, to try to prove that discriminatory intent, and that the evidence was not sufficient basically for the 2013 maps to be shown to be intentionally discriminatory. Generally, it's a long opinion with some exceptions, but that's fundamentally it. And there's one part of the opinion that scares me, and I'm really not up on what everybody else says about this as much. Maybe Joaquin would add something to this eventually too, but Justice Alito said that the good faith of the state legislature must be presumed in that opinion. And I think it's really not in the law, but it's in the case now. And it's, I think something that deference to the legislature is ominous as we go forward in this next round. Next slide, please. Finally, it's Rucho versus Common Cause, where was the case where North Carolina had a horrible Republican gerrymander. Maryland wasn't, I forget the name of the Maryland case, but was decided at the same time as Rucho, but it was a Democratic gerrymander of Maryland. But the court just said that partisan gerrymanders are a non-justiciable political question that the court can't decide. And even though the court went on and on about how, it sure could be unconstitutional and a violation of the 14th Amendment if there was partisan gerrymandering or extreme partisan gerrymandering, the court refused to do anything else about that and said it was a political question, but then left it open for the Congress to decide. And because of the way the Constitution is written, the Congress could do something about it and outlaw partisan gerrymandering or set standards for how it could be determined. And the court left that avenue open. Next slide. Those are the three big cases that I think will change stuff. There's a couple of other cases that I just want to mention. In 2016, there was a case called Evanwell versus Abbott, which is also a Texas case, where there was a contest about whether the Texas way to apportion districts by total population, which is what the 14th Amendment says and the Constitution says and everything else, but that people have questioned that and said that instead districts should only be apportioned by voter eligible population. The court, because of the way that case came to the court, said Texas certainly was in a constitutional status, a good constitutional basis to say that it could draw its legislative districts by total population. But the court kind of left open the question and didn't really resolve whether states might, for their legislative districts, this would not apply to congressional districts, draw districts to equalize voter eligible population rather than total population. And there's been some discussion, rumors that in this next redistricting session, the legislature might try to do that. Whether or not they'd be able to, whether or not they even had the data available to do that is a big question. But I just wanted to raise that for everybody as something to think about. Next slide. I'm kind of trying to move through these as quickly as possible. And I apologize, this list of cases is a little tedious maybe, but this is the only way I know how to do it. So another case I wanted you to be aware of is a case that is sort of not, I guess it's technically been dismissed by a stipulation, but it was the case National Urban League versus Raimundo, who's now the Secretary of the Commerce. But it was originally brought because of the Trump administration's attempt to get citizenship data and exclude non-citizens from the count. What happened to that case is that it was agreed to a settlement and a stipulation that the Census Bureau would not use citizenship data in determining apportionment or the redistricting numbers. And then there's an interesting provision in that stipulation also that the Bureau declared that any citizenship data that it was creating that might exclude undocumented people would be statistically unfit for use for apportionment or redistricting purposes. I'm not sure what the impact of that'll be, but I'm wondering if that might be something that could be used if there's people in the legislature who try to draw districts by citizen eligible criteria, that there would just what the Bureau has stipulated to might be such that it could keep them from getting that information. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure where they would get the information to do that from the census anyway, because a lot of this information is not explicitly created. There's a lot of surveys and other things that get that information, but it's not pure census data. There are technical reasons why later on in litigation, sometimes those things can be used. So I'm not saying it can't happen, but I think it's an interesting question. Okay. One last case I want you to know about is that next slide, please. I'm sorry. Is a case that just got filed a few days ago called Gutierrez versus Abbott. And this is a case by Senator Gutierrez and Senator Eckhart, state senators. And Texas Constitution has a really weird provision in it that says, at least as far as state legislative districts, the legislature is required to apportion the districts in the first regular session following the publication of the United States Decennial Census. And in this last census, well, as we all know, the data didn't really come out until after the regular session was even over. And so the Senator Gutierrez and Eckhart's case basically says that as far as just the state house and Senate districts, this would not apply to the congressional districts, but as far as those districts, it would be against the Texas Constitution for the legislature to draw those maps. And so they're either going to have to wait until the next regular session, or what they're asking for in this lawsuit in federal court in Austin is that the court draw interim maps for the state house and state Senate districts. And so that's an interesting case. It just got filed. They've asked for an injunction, and it's unclear whether the case will even continue on. There's some other things about it that are interesting, and other interests groups that have interest in these issues too. So, but it's anyway, it's an important case, because if the court would actually issue an injunction and it would stick, it would take it away from the legislature as far as the state house and senate districts. Next slide. I want to move now. Oh, yeah, that's just the Texas constitutional provision. I threw that in there. Next slide. I want to talk just briefly in whatever time I got left. Gina, don't let me go
Just
too
a few
long.
minutes.
Okay, I'm trying to go fast. About what has been done in the last regular session. The Fair Maps Texas group has supported for this session and the previous session that we've been in existence, the creation of an independent citizens redistricting commission, and with some specific criteria to sort of take it away from the legislature, to eliminate, so that citizens draw the maps, not politicians, that eliminate conflicts of interest, and with some specific map criteria that would require them to consider the Voting Rights Act, first of all, and communities of interest. And then it would also do away with partisan gerrymandering. So those are all the independent citizens redistricting commissions, those are the criteria that we favor. And next slide, please. In the last regular session, a number of representatives and several representatives and senators, state senators, filed bills for the creation of independent citizens redistricting commission. That legislation, some of it got hearings, none of them got a vote, but basically the Gonzalez bill would apply only to congressional races, but basically these were proposals to create the type of citizen redistricting commission that our Fair Maps Texas group has advocated for. Next slide. I also wanted to mention that there was some, there were some bipartisan commission proposals that were also filed in the legislature, which the Fair Maps group, I think, views as definitely much more preferable than having the politicians draw their own maps. It would require some bipartisanship, but is not truly a citizen, would not be truly a citizen redistricting commission. That was filed by Representative Anchia, Representative Howard, and Senator West and Senator Johnson. Different provisions for they're slightly different bipartisan commissions, but those were all filed and never got a vote out of committee. So both the IRCs and these bipartisan commissions never got a vote. Next slide. There's an issue about prison gerrymandering, about the residency of the prison population, and there were several bills that were filed about that. Because it tends to skew the population figures because of the concentration of people in prison who are really from different parts of the state, and their bills to try to consider where they came from rather than lumping them in a rural area, basically, usually where the prisons are located. So those bills were filed in the last regular session, and that they also never got a vote. I don't think any of them got a vote even out of committee. So all these reform proposals didn't go anywhere there, but they are probably, I think there's a possibility, and it may have already, I don't know, well, it wouldn't have happened already, but they may get filed in the special session, just at least sort of as a pro forma thing. And if they do get filed, we would be advocating that they get a hearing even during a special session, just as a matter of principle. Next slide. Finally, the piece of legislation that excuse me, that we were real involved with was HB 3112, and Gina deserves a lot of credit for this. She did a lot of work on this, the Texas Redistricting Transparency Act. Gosh, I'm losing my voice, excuse me. I'm used to talking to nobody but my cat most of the day. most days. Anyway, the Fair Maps Texas has had a fair and open campaign that's up on our website, and I've got the link there for a long time, where we've been advocating for full disclosure of and transparency in the entire redistricting process. And we've got a number of recommendations up on that website for how the legislature should conduct the process to make sure that it's fully open to the public. And that it sort of became the basis for us to also support a bill by Representative Jessica Gonzalez that got filed in the regular session, HB 3112, and she was good enough to file it again even in the first special session, and that's HB 165. And I think, Gina, did you hear from Zanir? I think he's going to file it again in the next one, right?
Yeah, they're planning on it.
Excuse me.
Yeah, so we'll give Dave a moment here.
Get a trickle.
Melanie, if you could move to
Okay.
slide 17, that really lays out what the Texas Redistricting Transparency Act is all about. Dave, go for it.
Yeah, it's just an attempt to try to set as many specific criteria as we could to make sure that the legislature can't get away with using data that maybe only they know or only their experts know in drawing maps, because there's so much personal information out there these days that you can find out block by block, house by house. It provides for full disclosure of that. It provides for the creation of a website where those things can all be published or have to be published. It requires the data to be disclosed, but then probably most importantly, it's got provisions about when maps are actually drawn, that there has to be an opportunity for the public to have time enough to evaluate those maps, and then also have input, be allowed to testify. And the timeline for doing that varies depending on what it is. One of the things that's happened in the past, and you know, if it's possible, I don't know if you guys can go backwards on my slide, but the slide before this slide is actually sort of interesting because it points out what has happened before, what happened in the 2011 round. And the reason why this transparency is so important. This is an excerpt from testimony in 2012 from it wasn't called Abbott versus Perez then, but whatever it was called, that the Texas redistricting case. You know, actually, it may have been from the pre-clearance case that was still pending at that time. In any event, Mark Vesey, who's now a congressman, was a state representative and was actually on the State House Redistricting Committee when the maps were drawn in 2011. And this is his testimony about the fact that even as a member of that committee, the maps got changed at the last minute. He says his testimony is, I found that my district was changed late at night. So we were having committee hearings. I just happened to be, he looks at this Red Apple, which is the state's computer program for dealing with districting. He said, found my district and found my district had been completely changed from what we had all agreed to. So what can happen is that there can be last minute amendments that change everything or make important changes that disadvantage people. And the intent of the Redistricting Transparency Act, the Fair Maps, Fair and Open campaign, is to try to keep that from happening, because the legislature has a really bad habit of putting in last minute committee substitutes for things and not telling people, and for changing things around. And it's, I mean, even in this case, I think it's amazing. Representative Vesey, as a member of the committee, in fact, was not aware of what happened. So that's why we're strong advocates for these transparency proposals. We tried actually with, it wasn't us, but Representative Anchia and I think it was Representative Turner also before this last regular session, tried to get some rule changes made in the House, the State House, to impose some of these requirements, and they were all voted down on a party line vote. So.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
that's
thank
it,
you. Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. We're going to pause for a moment real quick for a quick question. And I'll give Melanie a few minutes to get Joaquin's slides ready to go. So Steph, if you don't mind answering this question, does the legislature, if you can, does the legislature have time to purge voter rolls before they redistrict, and what kind of impact would that have on the process?
The voter rolls and redistricting are kind of two separate issues. Joaquin is the attorney, though, so he'd be more qualified to answer that question. But those two things are completely separate. So the population that they use, the data source that they use to draw the districts, is going to be that census data. But Joaquin might have something else to add to that.
No, that's right. Yeah, it doesn't directly affect redistricting because they're just using the census data, not the voter rolls. Though, of course, they take into account sort of the partisan makeup of districts when they're drawing the districts.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Joaquin. And then how accurate, and this kind of, maybe this will be a good transition into your portion of the presentation, where we are now, what the census data is showing us. And one of the questions was, how accurate do we know, or do we think the last census was, especially given that there may have been many undocumented Texans who were afraid to fill out census materials.
So we don't know for sure, how inaccurate or accurate it was. Texas was originally projected to have, a couple percent, basically 1.5%, 2% higher population than it did end up having in the census, just in terms of statewide. And almost certainly that's not equally distributed across the state. So just out of curiosity, I'd done some looking when the original just state level census apportionment numbers came out. And there definitely was a correlation between the Latino population in states and the, the how far below, I guess, their projected numbers were. And there was an even stronger correlation between whether states spent money on census counts and whether they met their projections. And Texas did not spend any money. So but especially with the online responses and COVID and relying more on the self-response, undoubtedly, it was communities with large immigrant populations and just economically disadvantaged communities that responded less. So certainly an undercount, I'm sure, but we don't have any sort of hard data on that yet.
Well, thank you. So why don't we pivot now to where we are, and kind of, again, you kind of laid out a little bit about where we're a little bit less than we anticipated census wise, and where that takes us in this next special session.
Yeah. So just, I guess, a timeline, sort of where we are and process-wise where we are. So as Dave mentioned, typically this is done during the regular session after census data comes out. So it should have been completed already by now. Usually the state would have gotten the data in March and finished drawing maps by the end of April. But because of the COVID delays, that didn't happen. So the state got the data in mid-August, and we are just now about to start the special session at which the legislature is going to attempt to redraw maps as Dave mentioned, there's some pending litigation over that, but barring that changing things or another quorum break. So it's still unknowns, but in theory, they're going to start trying to draw maps, and that special session is going to start on September 20th right now. And what I think share some links on this a little later, but they are having some public input hearings leading up to that. They're just sort of wrapping those up, but there's a couple more before the 20th. And then it's, nobody, well, I'm sure the leadership of the House and Senate know, but general public and anybody that will talk to me doesn't, really know what the timeline is when special session starts, how quickly they will release their proposed maps. I heard that they did ask for members to submit map proposals before special session. So, they may be coming up with them pretty quickly, but basically this first special session is going to be 30 days. So it's, if they're trying to get these maps in that 30 days, it's going to be a pretty quick process. And, quickly coming upon the filing deadlines for candidates for the March primaries, they did pass this bill that sort of steps back those primaries depending on when maps are actually passed. But they gave themselves to November 15th to keep the current primary elections in place. And from everything I hear, that is the leadership's intent to try to have maps drawn by November 15th. And I don't know if this was mentioned, but just a very basic point. There's actually 4 elected bodies that are going to be redistricted during the special session. The U.S. congressional districts, the state Senate districts, the state House districts, and the State Board of Education. And so basically they're going to try to do all of those because these are all subject to federal constitutional one person, one vote requirements. So if they were to not redraw districts, they could potentially be sued and have a court imposed plan. So just looking a little bit, turning towards the census numbers and what we saw, if you want to maybe share my first slide. So overall, Texas gained enough population to get 2 new congressional seats. So currently we have 36 seats, and we're going to pick up 2 more seats. So this is a map that just shows the current congressional districts. Probably can't see detail in sort of the Dallas and Harris County areas, but it shows overall the population deviations, and you can get a sense of where those are. So the darker blue, the higher the deviation, and you can see some of these numbers. So basically what this deviation is if you take the Texas's total population divided by the 38 congressional districts, that gives you the ideal district size. And so these deviations are what percentage above or below the current districts are. So the most out of the most deviated ones, I guess, are these areas in the suburban areas around Harris and Austin and Dallas, DFW area. And that's where the state saw the most growth. So all those districts are going to have to be heavily changed just by virtue of the fact that they need to be brought into compliance with the population deviations. And what we saw, I don't have a slide on this, but just in terms of the type of growth we saw, so 95% of the growth in Texas came from communities of color. So only 5% came from non-Hispanic white population. The Hispanic population is now basically equal with the non-Hispanic white population, and the Asian population actually grew at the quickest rate across the state. It's still, only makes up about 6 or 7% of the state, but it almost doubled. And pretty much you saw all these suburban regions, which you can tell became overpopulated, grew across all, the Hispanic, Black, Asian populations really skyrocketed in all these areas. So now a lot of these suburban counties that used to be pretty homogenous, Anglo conservative, are now diverse counties and politically, much more, I guess, on the margins politically. If you want to go to the next slide, this is the Texas Senate districts. Again, it's pretty much the same areas. You see a little bit. The district with the most deviation is Senate District 25 with 18% deviation. So again, all these areas that are the darkest blue, those are where the most redistricting will necessarily take place. And I think you can especially see this on the next slide, which shows Texas House District. But in addition to these suburban areas really growing, rural areas lost a lot of population. So you'll see some of the areas, especially these areas that are white colored, that are very underpopulated, they actually lost population. And then some of these other areas that are sort of light blue, they may not have lost population, but they didn't gain enough population to keep track with the growth in the other areas. So they're going to have to, basically lose representation and have their districts consolidated in one fashion or another. So in the, I don't know if you mentioned this, Dave, but there's a special rule in the Texas House where, to the greatest extent possible, county lines have to be respected. So, you see a little bit more geographic uniformity in the districts in the Texas House, but it's really all these rural districts and South Texas districts are there's going to lose representation in one way or the other and sort of have their districts consolidated. And then on the next two slides, just to give you a little bit better idea, I did a zoom in of the DFW area House district. So again, because of this county line rule, before drawing districts, they first tell each county basically how many districts they're going to get. And so Collin County and Denton County, this is their current makeup, but they're each going to get one new state house district. So, especially given the populations, it will be, difficult to not give some representation to the diversifying communities there. And then you see, slightly lower growth rates in Dallas and Tarrant, but still some areas that are very overpopulated. Both Dallas is sort of on the edge of losing potentially one of its state house districts, but I think they might be able to keep it. And so these areas will sort of stay relatively, a little bit of change within the counties, but should stay relatively similar. And then on the next slide, I did a close up of the Harris County, Bexar County, Travis County. Fort Bend County also is going to gain a whole new state house district. Harris County will keep the same number as Bexar County's a little bit on the edge, but Travis County I guess it'll probably split open, and because it has a little bit too much population. And then you see like Hayes County right now makes up a state house district with Blanco County, but Hayes is actually now big enough to have its own district plus some. So again, sort of all these suburban areas gaining more representation. And that's, I think it in terms of census information. I don't know if there was anything else on that you wanted me to talk about, Gina?
No, that's great. So let's just focus just real quick. We're running short on time here, so I want to make sure that everybody has the information they need. I know you had mentioned it November 15th was the date by which we need to have all of the lines drawn, but there was legislation proposed that could basically change the filing deadlines for those spring primaries. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was proposed and passed, so it's in place. So if they don't draw the maps by November 15th, then I think it kicks there's sort of like a time window of like if it's not before November 15th, but it is before January, then the primary is like in April or May or something, and it sort of keeps pushing it back. But particularly if you're saying like the November 15th date, if we don't have maps by then and the filing deadline's going to be December 15th, it's going to create a lot of chaos just at the election administration level. And so if you don't mind, can we just drill down on the process? So right now, one of the action items that we have for everybody tonight, there are the House and Senate redistricting committees for the last 2 years have been going around the state, mostly virtually now, and getting testimony from citizens and interested parties on what they would like to see in the upcoming redistricting process. So that's kind of the step one of the process. Can you tell us kind of what will happen? How many rounds, are they both have their own hearings? What do we need a conference committee? Can you kind of walk us through very quickly, brief, high level of what it's going to look like in this special session? Yeah, a lot of details are still unknown, but basically how it's gone in the past is the State House will take care of the State House maps, and those will originate there, and the State Senate will take care of the State Senate maps, and then each of those chambers, will have some form of hearing on their legislation, and the chairs have both committed to having hearings on those map proposals. And I believe somebody, I didn't catch it, but somebody said that the House had said, the chairman said that there'd be virtual testimony available on the House maps. They haven't committed to, how much notice they're going to give or that sort of thing. So that's a big thing, pushing for enough notice to actually look at the maps so people can understand what's going on. And then the same for the congressional maps. The only difference is there may be, they could originate in either chamber. And so there may be competing maps. The Texas Senate may have one map and the Texas House may have another. But presumably they're also going to hold hearings on those maps. And same for State Board of Education. But that's sort of the next process, is introducing the maps, and then hopefully they'll give a little time to review them before any hearings, and then the committees will vote on those maps. Okay, great. Thank you, Joaquin. So I got a question that kind of leads us into our next line of, or next part of our program, which is the actionable items. And people want to know so let me make sure I'm reading this right. It was sent just to me. What effect can committee testimony done by volunteers like us have on the maps drawn? What maybe, and staff or Joaquin, maybe you can kind of talk about some of the things that we prepare our volunteers to do when testifying and what they're looking for.
So I was going to say in 2011, a lot of the House of Representatives, the State House of Representatives, drew their own election maps. And so I think we can have some influence over what those maps look like. This becomes even more important if you live in a community of color or you are a voter of color. You want to make sure that your community is protected and gets a proper representation under the Voting Rights Act. And so for the latter, if testimony on your community of interest, and if the legislator does produce a map that intentionally discriminates or discriminates against voters of color, then your testimony could be used as evidence in future litigation. Here you would have the legislator drawing a map that discriminates, and you have members of the community saying, don't do this to me, you're essentially going to screw me over. And so that does become very useful. Another thing I was going to mention is all of the stuff that Dave mentioned from the Fair and Open campaign that was included in that one bill, HB 3112. All of those can be used as talking points. So there is no guarantee at this point that they're actually going to show us the maps. In 2011, they didn't show the maps to even, I guess it was in 2013, they didn't show the maps to the full committee. They passed it out of committee without even showing the Democrats. And so we have to be on watch and we have to be ready. And so it's very important for folks to show up and the public to show up and say, here's my testimony on my community of interest. This is where my neighborhood is located. And I want you to show me the maps. Or I want, we have like specific procedural rules that we're asking for that we've asked the public to basically regurgitate to the committee, just so the committee knows that the people are watching. And then it also helps us, you know, again, create a record for litigation, because most likely what's going to happen is they're not going to listen to us.
All right, and Melanie, this is a great time. Could you just throw up the slide of the actionable items? And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask you, Steph, somebody asked the question, do we think there's ever going to be a chance that there will be a fair and open process, redistricting process here in Texas?
You know, I would, yeah, I'll share a story. So back in the mid 2000s, there was a state senator by the name of Jeff Wentworth from Central Texas, and he was a Republican. And he almost got through a bill for a bipartisan commission for our congressional districts. And so Jeff Wentworth was around in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when Democrats really heavily gerrymandered against the Republicans here in Texas. And he saw the effects firsthand of how devastating that was to his party and to his communities. And so what he did, even after Republicans took control of the legislature, was fight for this legislation that would have created a citizens commission, a bipartisan citizens commission. And so I'm hopeful that one day, maybe again, that we can have a commission of some sort, but I think that's going to be a long time away. A very long time away. And then importantly, at the national level, there are two bills that we definitely want to support. One of them is the For the People Act, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of. And then the other one is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Both of these bills are very important to redistricting and to creating a fair and open redistricting process that everyone would like to see enacted. So we're not lost, completely lost yet. We're close. But we have to keep fighting, right?
Right. And so we've put up some, suggestions which are very similar to what a normal session would look like. Contact your state representatives, both the senators and your state reps, and ask them to support the legislation. Someone just posted the Texas Redistricting Transparency Act, or HB 3112, in the regular session. We're hoping it'll be filed again in the coming week as soon as the special session starts. Unfortunately, it did not even receive a hearing, despite our best attempts to do that in the regular session. But again, for pro forma reasons, obviously it wouldn't have an impact on this cycle right now, but it's something that you can do to show your support for the fair and open redistricting campaign. And other like-minded legislation that Dave mentioned. I should also mention that we will be sending out a follow-up email with a lot of this information. So worry. We'll have your talking points for you. We'll have the legislation to support, and that'll be coming in the next day or so. And if you have, just like a regular session, if you have a contact with a member who is on the House or Senate Redistricting Committee, contact them, have a meeting, talk about the fair and open principles, ask them, give us a week, give us 3 days, give us 1 day to take a look at these maps, let you know how they're going to affect our own communities, and then you can vote on them. These are important things. We just have to keep asking. We have to let our representatives know that we are aware, we're here, we're paying attention, and we have to hold them accountable. Writing an op-ed or posting on social media is great. As we said, there's more opportunities to testify September 15th and 18th. You can the House has 2 committee hearings left to testify about your own community of interest. And if you don't feel like you belong in that testimony, there's also the opportunity to write your testimony, and please pass it along to any other like-minded organizations that might be affected by the redistricting process or negatively impacted, so that we can have their testimony on record. So is there anything else that we have questions about? Let me just check and make sure we are.
While you're looking at that, Gina, as far as what Stephanie mentioned with the Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act, there's a lot going to be happening in the next week about that. You may want to check out an organization on the national level. That's a whole bunch it's a huge coalition. It's called the Declaration for American Democracy, DFAD.org. There's on the 17th of this, that's just coming up, they're having a nationwide, what they call Finish the Job Day of Action, to try to support passage of the For the People Act. And anyone that's been following it would know that there is an issue there about the filibuster, and the support of a couple of Democratic senators is necessary for that. And apparently even today, Senator Schumer made some remarks about the fact that they've made progress on what everybody's calling the Manchin Compromise, which is a way to try to get enough Democratic support for that legislation. So that's a real important thing to advocate for in the next week or two, because it would change the rules for Texas. I mean, if most of the For the People Act passed, it would really make a huge difference in how we deal with things here in Texas.
Yeah, and thank you to Stephanie and to Melanie for posting the members. And again, we'll send all of this out again, but you can find the members of the Senate and House redistricting committees and the links attached. And one more question. Are the redistricting committee members, are they required to show diversity as it draws the lines? Is there anything that says we have a certain percentage of this population in this map that kind of holds them accountable, or not really?
So, basically the Voting Rights Act is the constraint there. It's a little complicated. There's lots of legal tests about exactly what you have to do to comply with that. So it's, not quite as simple as like, there's just these numeric cutoffs, but it does still, Section 2 does still protect certain minority opportunity districts, and the legislature would definitely be risking a Voting Rights Act violation if it were to diminish those districts significantly.
Okay, thank you, Joaquin.
I want
Go
to
ahead,
follow
Steph.
really quickly on that, because that's why I put the Fair and Open campaign in the chat. So that's one of the talking points that we're asking people to show up and talk about. We've asked them to basically give an analysis of how these districts that they draw are going to impact voters of color. And so that's one of the talking points, and I just wanted to mention it. So we have some pretty simple ones on that Fair and Open campaign, so please check them out, and then you can use those talking points in your testimony as well.
Awesome. Well, I think we are about 10 minutes over. So I want to thank our speakers. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Joaquin. Thank you, Dave. This has been very intensive, been very informative, and we really appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge with us this evening. And thank you again to everyone for coming. This is an NCJW and Women of Dallas United for Action event, so we would be remiss if we didn't ask you to please reach out to your congressional House rep. That's the federal level. They are calling a vote on HR 3755, the Women's Health Protection Act of 2021. I think sometime next week, that will hopefully circumvent a lot of the things that are happening with abortion here in Texas. So if you have a moment, just give them a call and ask them to vote for HR 3755. And thank you again for joining us tonight. And to the NCJW staff who were instrumental in working with us in all of our slides. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Elaine, again. And again, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a lot of this information to help you move forward in your advocacy for redistricting. And we really appreciate it. And we hope everybody has a wonderful evening. Thank you.